Well, welcome to the last, I'm not here, but I'm kind of here lesson that you're going to watch. This lesson is about classifying organisms. In your textbook, all of this information is found in section 3.2. So if you'd like a reference, it's there. Now this first little bit is sort of glossed over in your textbook, so I feel like we need to add it in a little bit. But we're talking about why we would classify an organism. What is the purpose? So why do I need to know that this is a plant and this is an animal? What's the reason? Well, one of the reasons is that it's predictive. If I find a number of members that are in a classified group that have a characteristic, then another species that's also part of that group will probably also have this characteristic. Now, what does this mean for real life? We're going to take two plants as our example. So let's say we have two plants, and two plants have the same genus. Now we're going to talk about what this word means. It's one of the levels of classification, but when we talk about a species, we normally have two words for it. So for example, humans are Homo sapiens. Genus is the first of those two words. So let's say I have two plants, and one of them is a source of a food or drug. There's a reasonable chance that the other will have that too. So there's a substance called Taxol that comes from this tree, the Pacific yew tree. Its scientific name is Taxus brevifolia. So Taxus is the genus, brevifolia is the species. It's being used to treat breast cancer, but you require a large number of trees worth of bark to treat a single patient. A thorough search has shown that Taxol also occurs in other species that are part of this same genus, Taxus. So other yew trees also have this substance. So it's useful that we've classified these trees based on genus and species so we know which trees are closely related to the Pacific yew. Now another reason that it's good to classify organisms is it's easier to identify species. Now if I found a new species or I found an organism and I didn't know which species it was, it would be easier to find out if they're already classified. So what we're saying is it makes it easier for scientists to figure out what it is they're looking at if there's a classification scheme already in place. So I'm going to use this example of edible sea snails. So I've got some photos here on the right of what some sea snails look like. From the front, from the side, so that you can see some of their visible characteristics. And these are all classified. So you can see they have names, H. iris, H. virginia, H. australis. They have different names so that you can see different characteristics of the different kinds of sea snails. Now I know there are places where you can go and you can collect things yourself to consume them. Sea snails could be one of them, you know, if you're at the beach or you're at the ocean. But even things like edible fruit. Having a classification scheme in place would help us identify, say we were out in the forest, which types of fruit are edible and which types are not. Now the third reason that we would want to classify organisms is because of evolution, and we've already talked about evolution at some great lengths. Species that are in the same group probably share characteristics because they have a common ancestor. And so one of the things that you'll see is that it's very probable that each group of organisms that we classify is based on the idea of a common ancestor. Now we're classifying organisms based on characteristics that they have, but our idea is that organisms share characteristics because they have a common ancestor. And we might be able to use classification to give some distinction on how they evolved. So I've got some examples here on the bottom. The first are silver sorts. These two plants are both silver sorts. They're incredibly diverse in their form and habitat, And what we think is that perhaps this great diversity in their structural and physical characteristics is derived from the transition from wet to dry. The idea being that the Hawaiian Islands were at one point attached to some sort of mainland, and over time geographic isolation occurred, and species adapted differently to the climates on the different islands that they were found on. Another example is this idea of the southern beech. It's a type of tree. Its genus is Notophagus, and then there's a number of species in that genus. They are found both in New Zealand and South America. So if we think about South America and we think about New Zealand and we think about how continents might have been attached in the past, remember that we think that there's a lot of connection between continents that now seem very far apart. So the fact that something is found both in New Zealand and southern South America, so here's southern South America, New Zealand's kind of off in the corner down here. Well, that might be due to the fact that all of the continents were sort of pushed together and that they evolved over time to be slightly different species. It also helps explain the date of divergences. So knowing what types of species exist and knowing what happened geologically might help us explain when these two species diverged from each other and started being new species as opposed to the same species in the same area. This just means approximately, the CA means circa 80, MYA means million years ago. So we think that that might be when that possibly happened. Now, what is taxonomy? Well, it's the process of classifying or organizing organisms based on shared characteristics. And this is really the key. This is how we decide what group organisms go into. We look at their characteristics. It has to be characteristics that you can see, that are observable, so that we could use them to classify organisms. Basically, we have a system of rules, and we're going to classify organisms into a bunch of different categories. Now, if you look at the picture over here, species is the narrowest. That means that there's no smaller category than it. Up here, domain is the broadest one that we will look at. Technically, life could be the biggest category, but we're not going to discuss things that are not living. So we're going to focus just on domains. When we take a look at how organisms are classified, we'll start by talking about domains. If I take all living organisms, I can split them up into two basic categories: prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Eukaryotic organisms are a domain. So are the two categories of prokaryotic organisms. And you might ask yourself, well, that's kind of weird. Why would we split all things that are prokaryotic up into two categories? But it's actually because they have very different characteristics. So these three are the domains: archaebacteria, eubacteria, and eukaryotic cells. Now, a lot of the time, the names are Latinized or Latinified. So if you look in your textbook, you'll see that we call this domain eukarya. We've got the Y end at the end. We call the archaebacteria archaea. And we call the eubacteria just bacteria. But those are the three domains. So the domain eukarya has eukaryotic cells in it. The domain archaea has archaebacteria in it. And the domain bacteria has eubacteria in it. That's how we classify the three domains. Now on page 87 of your textbook is where you'll find some of the distinguishing characteristics of those three domains. So you should be able to recognize, for example, that things that are in the domain eukarya have organelles. They have membrane-bound organelles. That's a really distinguishing feature. Not that they have better things than the other types of cells, but they definitely have organelles. The other types, the bacteria and archaebacteria, have everything they need to function, but their organelles, especially their nucleus, is not membrane bound. So instead of having all of the DNA contained within a nucleus, in archaebacteria and bacteria, they both don't have that. Now, both of these categories reproduce asexually only. The category eukarya can do sexual reproduction. If I take a look at some of the other characteristics, they can all have autotrophic characteristics. So something that's the same between all of them is that all three categories have some autotrophic organisms. For example, in the archaea category, some of them are chemosynthesis, but there can also be heterotrophic organisms as well. But when we take a look at the basic differences, those are some things that really pop out at you, some things that are really noticeably different. Now there are some tricks that you can use to remember the order of taxonomy classifications. I'll tell you right away that knowing the order of the classifications is not my #1 goal for you. My goal is for you to understand why we would classify and what classifying organisms means about their evolution and about their development. So if I take a look at this little chart here, you'll see that I'm going to use a little mnemonic that uses the first letter of each of these. And it starts with the biggest category and ends with the smallest one. The little mnemonic is Danish. King Philip came over for green spinach. So Danish King Philip came over for green spinach. Or any other ridiculous sentence that you think that will help you remember this. This is just the one that I've always known and the one that I've always used. Now you'll notice on this diagram, it goes a little bit further than domains. So it goes on to talk about kingdoms. And kingdoms are the next step down, or the next step away from being a very broad category. They're getting a little bit more specific. So you can see, if we talk about the domain eukarya, there are some kingdoms that are part of it. There's protista, which can be multi or unicellular, and then there are the rest of them that have to be multicellular. The next characteristic is autotrophic or heterotrophic, and the next category is how they obtain their nutrition. What we're looking at here, this little chart that constantly separates things into two categories, this is the base of a dichotomous key, which is something that we'll come back to at the end of the lesson. But we are constantly separating things into categories based on a characteristic that's shared. Now, when we talk about taxonomy, we talk about the scientific name of an organism. Linnaeus is the guy who probably shows up. He developed this system of what's called binomial. Bi means two, nomial means name. So literally this is two-name nomenclature. Nomenclature, you might remember from Science 10, is a fancy way of saying how we name things. This means that every organism can be identified using two names. And I'm going to put a little star here because now, Linnaeus, he was around quite a number of years ago, we've realized that maybe we need to be a little bit more specific. So some organisms actually have 3 names instead of just 2. But for the most part, organisms can be classified with 2 names. and that's what we'll focus on. These are the rules for binomial nomenclature. The first name is always the genus. So of that big list, Danish King Edward came over for Danish King Philip came over for green spinach. We're just going to use the genus and species part to give the scientific name of the organism. So the first name is the genus. The genus always has an uppercase first letter. Sometimes you'll even see that we don't even write the whole word. We just write the first letter. So for example, sometimes for a human, we would just write capital H sapiens. The second name is the species. So of that big list, it's the narrowest category, so it's the second part. The species name has a lowercase first letter. We generally use italics if we're printing it, like with a computer or some sort of electronic device. And if it's handwritten, you should underline it. And you can try to make italics yourself, but most of the time we'll be dealing with print, and so that won't be necessary. So I just put a couple of examples here to illustrate to you the scientific name, just because I want to show you a little bit about where scientific names come from. For example, sometimes the species name comes from location. So obviously that's making reference to the Mississippi River and the area around that. Sometimes, in this case it's the third name, it comes from not location, not necessarily range, but more like their habitat. So I'll take means at higher altitudes, so it's giving like a description of the environment that it lives in. And sometimes names are just literally physical descriptions. So Phascaloarctos cinereus, so it's derived from words that mean pouch, bear, and ash-colored. So there's a little koala bear, and we're literally saying this is a bear with a pouch that is gray. And so sometimes it is just physical description. Other times it's named for some other reason, perhaps the person who discovered it, but these are really common ways to have species be named. You do not have to memorize species names, you just have to understand what the two words mean. That the first word represents genus and the second word represents species. Now here we have a little repetition of the subdivisions. I've put them in order, starting with domain being the largest and species being the smallest. We know from our previous lessons that species are organisms that can reproduce together and have fertile offspring. Here's the little mnemonic that we would use. A reminder that page 87 will tell you characteristics of all of the domains. And here's a little representation of the three domains. So you'll see all living organisms start on this branch. And then things branch off and branch off some more. Notice how much space there is on the tree between one type of bacteria and the other. It's quite lengthy. That's why they actually got their own categories. Now look over here, there's animals, and all animals are at that point on this little tree of life. That means that we have more in common with, I don't know, let's pick a canary, than some types of bacteria do with each other. And that's why they needed their own area, their own domain for classification. Now I'm going to use my little species here on the side just to give you an idea of the types of things that get put into each category. The kingdom is probably something that you're familiar with. The kingdom tells you what basic type of organism it is. Is it an animal? Is it a plant? Is it a bacteria? The phylum is a little bit trickier. The phylum tells you some major characteristic of the organism. So for example, in the animal category, one of the phyla that exists is Chordata. Chordata is for organisms that have a spinal cord. And so some animals do and some animals don't. Class, you'll see, focuses on another characteristic that's not quite as big of a deal as the one that was in phylum, but it's still a major characteristic, a big category of organisms. So now I'm taking everything that has a spinal cord and I'm narrowing it down to things that are just mammals. Obviously, there would be things that are not mammals. So birds would not go in this category because they are not mammals. The next one is where we take yet another characteristic, but notice how we're getting more and more specific. The number of organisms that would fit in each category is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So what we're trying to say is every time we go down a level, we're getting more and more specific. Now, Felidae is the cat family. All cats are part of this family, even your kitty cat that you have at your house. But anything that you can think of as being cat-like would be found in this family. So this is where lions and tigers and anything of that sort would be found. Panthera is the genus for large cats. So Panthera is where you find things like Panthera pardus. Now the name Panthera pardus literally means the cat that has spots. So this is a leopard, it has spots, and the word pardus is talking about the spots. Now that's how you would classify that particular organism with its kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So we're getting more and more and more specific at each level. Its domain would of course be eukarya. And you'll notice here on that particular diagram, it says eukaryota instead of eukarya. The way that people Latinize the endings of the words really has quite a bit of variety, and it also depends which language you're speaking when you do it. Now here's an example where we can compare two organisms based on their taxonomic level. On one side we have humans, and on the other side we have the great white shark. So you'll notice that they have the same kingdom and they have the same phylum. They would also have the same domain if I were to include it, and it would be eukarya. So they are part of that domain, and that's what most of the organisms that we'll deal with will be part of, simply because those are the ones that you guys are more familiar with, and they're the ones that we've discussed at length in a lot of the food chains that we've used. So they have the same domain, they have the same kingdom, they have the same phylum. We already know what chordata means. It means spinal cord. But here's where they have a difference. Their class is not the same. So humans are mammals, and great white sharks are in this category called elasmobranchi. It has to do with the fact that they're made out of cartilage and the way that they breathe. So obviously, they're in a different class. And then notice that everything beyond that is different. Now, great white sharks are a particular type of shark, so that's why they're in this order Lamniform and Lamnidae. I'm not going to ask you to memorize what every class or order or family means. I would only ask that you recognize ones that we've studied. Like, you should know what a mammal is. A mammal is something that should be familiar to you. You should even be pretty clear on what a primate is. But knowing the specific details of each taxonomic level, that's quite a lengthy task. I wouldn't ask you to know that. What I would ask you to be able to describe is how closely related are two organisms. And the key would be that more levels in common equals more closely related. But the key is the levels that are in common have to start at the top with domain or kingdom or phylum. It might be possible in some cases for you to find two organisms that have the same word for one of these lower categories, even though the higher categories are not the same. And what I'd like to illustrate to you is that doesn't always mean that things are in the same taxonomic classification. For example, this word, aotus, it's actually the genus of two different things, a type of plant and a type of monkey. Now, obviously, if I have this word as the genus, you might think, oh, those two things are really closely related. But if I were to go up, I wouldn't find any of the same categories because I would go all the way up to kingdom and I would see that one of them was an animal and the other was a plant. And so you have to be careful. Just because two things have a same genus, a word for their genus or a word for their species name, doesn't mean that they're related. You have to look at how many categories they have in common, and the categories have to start at the top and go downwards. If there's a break, that means that we've repeated the same word. Now, it's discouraged for people to do that, but there are like 5,000 names that would illustrate this, where there are two different organisms that happen to have the same word as part of their name. Now the last thing that's in this section is the idea of a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key is a classification tool. So it's a way that a taxonomist, so someone who studies taxonomy, would go about classifying an organism. And like I mentioned before, it's like we're dividing things constantly in two. Di means two. So we're making a series of questions that can constantly divide a group of organisms into two. In a dichotomous key, we would have a series of numbered statements. So this is a dichotomous key. And you will have an assignment where you need to make a dichotomous key. A dichotomous key looks a lot like a choose your own adventure. If it's like this, go to number 2. If it's like this, go to number 4. Kind of like if you'd like to open the door, go to page 7. And if you'd like to walk down the hallway, go to page 10. Each of them leading to a different outcome. There is always a pair of alternatives. That means 2. Not 6, not 4, not 3, not 11, 2. There always have to be 2. Some alternatives would lead to the next set of statements. Others would just simply tell me the name of the organism. So often when people are trying to make a dichotomous key, they would start with this planning here. Now this is another way of representing the dichotomous key. It's not quite as formal, and when I ask you to make a dichotomous key, please make one like is shown on the bottom, with a series of statements where there's always 2 choices for each statement. But sometimes it's good to plan out how your dichotomous key is going to work so that you know what is supposed to go in each statement. So let's say we have these objects here. A highlighter, a pen, a paperclip, a pencil sharpener, and a pencil. If I was going to make a dichotomous key, the first thing I might notice is that some of them are long and tubular and others are short and not tubular. Generally, we want the 2 statements to be opposites. We don't want there to be any room for interpretation. So a lot of the time, one of the statements says something that they have, and the other statement says you simply don't have that. So instead of saying short and some other shape, I just said they were not tubular. That covers every other possible characteristic that I could have for shape. In my long tubular objects, which are the highlighter, the pen, and the pencil, you'll see that my next category is it plastic or is it something other than plastic? So I didn't make a list of the other materials it was made of. I said it wasn't plastic. Now here, I was a little bit more specific, and sometimes when you get to the last level of questioning, you have to be a little bit more precise so that you can identify both things in a specific way. The one that's gray and green is the highlighter, the one that's blue and clear is the pen, and the one that's constructed from something other than plastic is a pencil. In my short category, I only have 2 objects, my pencil sharpener and my paper clip, and so I went straight to color. Now sometimes at that last level, like I said, you have to be a bit more specific. There's always the potential that we would add to our dichotomous key. So remember that there's not necessarily one correct and one incorrect way of making a dichotomous key. It's always based on characteristics of the organisms or the objects that you're trying to classify, and legitimate distinctions where I can make groups of 2. Now, if I was to take my planning above and turn it into a dichotomous key, this is how it would look. My first question would be, what type of object is it? So every time you have a division, you need to have a question. So there's question 1. Question 2 is, what is it constructed from? Question 3 is here, and question 4 is down there. So when you're planning, every time you have a division, that's where you need to have a question. And you always need to tell me, where do I go next? If I said, yes, something is long and tubular, I obviously need to go to number 2. So this planning is often very helpful. So you'll see over here, I've written down what it is we're going to do. We're going to work together on creating dichotomous keys, and it comes from your textbook, page 90 and 91.